I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do.
Excuse me, Laurie.
Oh, Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. We're winding down the spooky season. We're in the home stretch right before Halloween. And on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Alexander Herbert, author of Fear Before the Fall, Horror Films in the Late Soviet Union. A rather underexplored topic. There has been discussion of the 1960s film V, and that'll factor into our discussion, but very few Soviet films that could fit into the horror genre have been discussed outside of V. So this is going to be a very interesting and hopefully enlightening conversation on a topic that many are not familiar with. With that being said, we'll get to the conversation with Alexander Herbert on Soviet horror films, but first, I want to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. Outside of my one sponsor, Mike Swanson of WallStreetWindow.com, it is your support on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews that allows me to produce this show. So please head on over to patreon.com/parallaxviews and kick me a donation if you can. Also, be sure to check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's WallStreetWindow.com, for the best trading and financial news. Very straight shooting. I trust Mike, and I've actually had listeners make return on investment due to his trading tips. Head on over to wallstreetwindow.com to subscribe to his newsletter, where you can also get his free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Once again, Mike is a great resource for trading and financial news, and I would highly recommend wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Alexander Herbert. Welcome to Parallax Views, Alexander Herbert, author of the new Zero Books title, and one that I think will fascinate both my horror movie loving audience and my sort of political history audience. Fear Before the Fall, Horror Films in the Late Soviet Union. How are you doing, Alexander?
I'm doing great. I just got back from Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, about a week ago. So I'm still it's a 9-hour time difference. So I'm still getting used to readjusting. But other than that, I'm doing great.
So for people that don't know, I'm assuming there's people that are listening to this saying, late Soviet horror? There were Soviet horror films? How did you get into this subject of Soviet horror movies? And maybe you can give a brief rundown of what constitutes the sort of Soviet horror genre.
Yeah, I grew up watching horror movies. It's always been my favorite genre of film for various reasons. But I've always had this idea of approaching history in ways that relate to other people. So I am a professor as my day job. I teach environmental history and history of modern Russia and modern Europe. And, you know, it's, of course, for me, it's fun to teach, you know, the political, the economic history of Stalinism and post-Stalinism and the revolution and yada yada. But I think that people really resonate with the history more when they can approach it from something that relates to them in some way. And so horror movies is one of those avenues that I thought contextualizing the history of the late Soviet period uh, within horror films would be fascinating. And then my book before that is about punk rock in the Soviet Union and in Russia as well. Because again, another thing that I grew up interested in, I grew up listening to punk, and so I wanted to understand the punk movement in the late Soviet period as well, and sort of be able to use these things pedagogically for students. So I also didn't know for a long time that the Soviet Union even had horror movies. As far as I understood, particularly in the early Stalin period, horror as a genre is sort of restricted from the canon of what was permissible, because they considered it to be bourgeois decadence, promoting, you know, grotesque images and harm to other people. And so they didn't, the state or the film guilds, I guess, would not sponsor the creation of horror films. That changes in the late Soviet period. And it doesn't, you know, it's not a flip of a switch that changes it. It's more of a gradual, as things begin to open up slower and slower, people start to experiment more with new storylines that are more paranormal than what existed before. That's how I got into it.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I sort of learned that there was Soviet horror movies in a very odd manner. Uh, I was at a movie convention at one point, and someone was trying to sell me on this movie because I asked them, "What's the most extreme movie you have?" And this is not a Soviet movie, but it is a very infamous movie. And it was a screener copy of a Serbian film. And they said, if you want the most extreme movie you possibly can watch, this is the one. And this is before it ever got released on Blu-ray officially. And then I started reading about Eastern European horror. And I was surprised to find out that there were these movies from the Soviet era that were horror movies. The main one being, and I'm going to botch the title, Vi or V.
B, yep.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that movie? Because I've always been fascinated by it. I have a copy of it somewhere around my house, actually, but it's a very interesting film.
Yeah, so V is the subject of the first chapter of my book, because chronologically, I guess you could pinpoint it as the first horror movie in the Soviet Union, although at the time it wasn't branded as such. It was considered a folklore movie because it's based on a Gogol short story, and the one of the leading directors behind it and set designers, Alexander Petushko, was famous for doing other fairy tale films, Ruslan and Ludmila being probably the most famous that he was responsible for. So it was pegged as a folklore movie, and that's how they got it past the censors as well. I know that the first script that they created for it was severely reeled back by the censors because it had more explicitly horroristic, I guess, themes than what they wanted, and so they kind of rewrote the script to tame it a little bit. But the story is still about a seminarian who accidentally murders a witch, and then as part of her dying request, he is tasked with saying prayers over the body for 3 nights. And each night, his torment gets worse and worse. And so I don't want to like fully spoil it for anyone, because it is definitely an extremely innovative film with a good storyline. Innovative in the way that it's directed, the cinematography, the sort of the props that they
I'm
employed.
assuming too, it may not be as hard to find as people think. I've found it on YouTube a few times. So
It's on YouTube, and I believe it's on Shudder too. It is free on YouTube, so yeah, it's pretty easy to find. It's English subtitled as well.
but you were saying in terms of the innovations, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, in terms of the innovations, for example, there's scenes where the witch kind of breaks out of her coffin, and the coffin moves around Homa, who is the main character, and they actually devise this mechanical uh, um, structure to move the coffin kind of in circle. And there's one scene where you can even hear the mechanism kind of whirling in the background. And the actress Natalia Varley fell off of the coffin of one of the first trials of it, and I think like sprained her arm or something like that. But it's just an example of, you know, everybody that I know who is very into films or horror films, who has watched that film, that who has watched that movie, has been really impressed by it. And you know, again, it's because it was sort of a super team project in the Soviet Union, and that is 1968. So it's very standalone. There's nothing produced before or after that, immediately after that, that could be considered as horror.
It's based off a short story, right?
It's based off of a short story by Nikolai Gogol, the Ukrainian writer, from his pre St. Petersburg tales. So um, a lot of what he wrote at that time was took place in the countryside with peasants and yada yada.
Yeah, I've always been particularly interested in that movie because in weird ways it's been remade over the years, right? Like the Mario Bava movie, Black Sunday, is very loosely based on that same story. And then I know in the 90s there was a Serbian remake of it called A Holy Place. So it seems like that specific story has a lot of staying power.
Yeah, the Mario Bava Black Sabbath is the film.
Oh, I was mixing it up with Black Sunday.
It's, yeah, Black Sabbath is like 3 short stories, and one of them is the story of V, essentially, which I think, you know, is done really well. There is another one done in the 90s, and then there's a remake of it in, I believe, 2014 in Russia,
Oh,
which
really? I
was
didn't even know that. Wow.
absolutely terrible. It's like they should have never given Russian directors access to CGI, because films out of Russia since then have been pretty atrocious. Not that there's a problem with CGI, it's fine, but it can be overused, and I think in this case, uh, definitely overused and poorly written script. But the original Soviet one, as most Soviet things, remains the best written, the best acting, the best set design, and the most innovative. So yeah, listeners should definitely, if any film in the book, should definitely watch that one.
Could you talk a little bit about how sort of folklore plays a role in Soviet horror like V? Because I mean, there's a lot of um, horror folklore that comes out of the Soviet Union. You know, like they even have their own version of out of Eastern Europe, I should say. There's even the whole sort of Russian vampire, which is the Vertolok, right? So can you talk about the influence of folklore on these things?
It's hard to say. So what's interesting is that all of the films that I wrote about were stories before they were turned into a book or a film. Not all of them by Russian authors. It's hard to say what the direct relationship between folklore and horror is, as like a, you know, one-to-one relationship, but it is clear that, you know, things like, as you said, vampires, werewolves, even, um, uh, etc., witches, you know, they have their origin in Eastern Europe in some form or another. And one of the major Gothic writers of the Russian imperial period, Alexei Tolstoy, who's a distant relative of the famous Tolstoy, wrote a whole bunch of short stories on paranormal. If anybody is into reading horror stories, Alexei Tolstoy is worth reading. And the Vampire Family, which is a film that I wrote about, is based on a Alexei Tolstoy story, and so is Bloodsuckers, is another Alexei Tolstoy story.
Yeah, I was gonna say he wrote the novella the Family of the Vorlak. So yeah.
So again, it's hard to say like deeply what the relationship with folklore is, but I think that again, it's another reason why the Soviet Union probably didn't embrace the genre so willingly at first, is just because it doesn't, as a officially atheistic state, it doesn't endorse paranormal, because the paranormal would suggest non-atheism, right? But Russia, the Baltic states, and parts of southern Eastern Europe have these rich traditions of paranormal creatures that I think were easily mobilized by aspiring horror directors to be used in film in exploring a new genre.
So how did we get I guess first, before the Soviet Union, there are horror movies that were made in Eastern Europe. I think many of them are lost. I think there was a 1909 silent film of V, actually. So it's interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how we get from the pre-Soviet era with film to the Soviet era, and then why there's such a long gap between the movie V and some of these other horror movies that you discussed from the Soviet Union.
All right. There's where to start with this? So horror films themselves are, the genre itself is one of the oldest genres in film. There are horror films that are written in the Russian Empire, as you said, they're silent films. Usually revolving around the devil, or bears. There's one about, I think, a woman that falls in love with a bear or something. I forget what it's called right now. But there is a tradition of horror films. It's one of the oldest genres in cinema. But as I said, after 1917, as the new regime takes control of cultural production, it sets limits on what is socially useful to developing socialism, and it considers Gothic themes and horror themes to be antithetical to developing socialism. And so the first minister of culture, Lunacharsky, of Narkompros, and also Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, who was the first kind of minister of education, they deem horror films as inappropriate, so they don't sanction them. And any major cultural undertaking, whether that be a film or something else, requires state sanctioning. It needs funding from the state to be produced. But again, it's not socially useful, so they don't produce horror films. They prefer to produce films that are themed on developing socialism, themed on revolution, drama films, war stories, etc. So that's sort of how you get, from, I guess, that early imperial period to the Soviet period, is just a disregard for the social value of horror as a genre that the early Soviet state considers, and it carries.
So basically, it's interesting to me. So you had movies before the Soviet Revolution, or even like right up to the cusp of it, like Satan Triumphant. And then after that, it's just sort of, very quickly sort of squelched. Any type of this genre is basically seen as you said, sort of bourgeois decadence, and there's a lot of just censorship of it, I guess, or suppression of it.
I wouldn't even necessarily call it censorship, although I think that's the easiest shorthand. It's more that the purveyors of culture, the creators of culture, those who back it, are tasked with, the bigger Soviet project, which is to create a new society. And as part of doing so, they understand that all cultural production, whether it be movies, books, art, pictorial art, anything, has to have has to contribute in some way to the construction of this new society. And horror is just, again, bourgeois decadence. It's irrelevant to the creation of socialism, right? To a atheistic socialism that in its project is trying to dispel what's the word I'm looking for? Superstitions amongst its people. There's a famous example that I use in my more academic work, which is about flood control in Leningrad. There's a major flood in Leningrad in 1924, and one of the newspapers reports that there were women who, in the middle of the flood, were throwing themselves off of the colonnade of St. Isaac's Cathedral in Leningrad, which is at that time, one of the highest points of the city, because they thought that it was the end of the world. And the newspaper proudly reports that as these women were throwing themselves off the colonnade, they were being rescued by the Komsomol. So it's almost like the Komsomol, the Communist Party, is bringing reality to these people. And so to promote paranormal ideas would be antithetical, right, to kind of material reality of what the Soviets are trying to promote. So yeah, I mean, that's how you get from the reality that there are horror films that are created even from the beginning of the moving image, and then it sort of stops in the Soviet period. And again, as Stalin becomes general secretary, socialist realism really amps up culturally, which again just intensifies this rejection of horror, of the paranormal. And so the genre itself cannot get sanctioned, cannot get financial backing, lacks public interest until the 60s. And even, as I said, V is not advertised as a horror film, it's advertised as a folklore film.
I was going to say, it seems like V is pretty singular within that period within Soviet cinema.
Yes, it absolutely stands out. But again, in the 60s and beginning in the late 50s and in the 60s, there's this massive I guess project or endeavor to create folklore films that glorify a sort of ancient Russian past. So again, you get Ruslan and Ludmila, which is based on Alexander Pushkin's short story. Ilya Muromets comes out in, I believe, 58 or 59, which is, the story of an old Russian warrior. There's other Finnish folklore films that are made, or I guess just Northern European, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of folklore stories that come out as a way of glorifying the past of the Soviet peoples, not just Russia itself, but demonstrating to the world that we have this old folklore tradition that's embedded in our past, that is worthy of exploration and celebration, but now we're doing something different.
So really, in dealing with V, in your book, you sort of deal with how perceptions are changing when it comes to consumer ethics.
Yeah. So each one of the chapters is centered on a film, and I use that film to make broader reflections about the changes that are going on in the late Soviet period. So V is the beginning of that, because 1968, it means that the film went into production in 66, 67, which is kind of considered high Brezhnevism. The beginning.
Yeah, we're a decade out from the death of Stalin.
Yeah, Stalin's long gone. Khrushchev has passed along, has been demoted, and Brezhnev is general secretary with Alexei Kosygin as the economic minister, really the powerhouse behind Soviet economic reforms and a push to improve the living standards of the Soviet people post Khrushchev. So what happens is after Stalin passes, Khrushchev promises the Soviet people that now that the war is done, we can pivot industry away from steel and other defense-related industries and pivot it more towards consumer industries, automobiles, washing machines, et cetera, to improve the living standards of the Soviet people. But unfortunately, what happens for Khrushchev is international relations and politics get way too carried away.
You cut out there for a second. You said he got way too carried away, and then it cut out.
It got carried away with international relations. Sorry. Under Khrushchev. So he made these promises to improve the living standards of the Soviet people with consumer goods, but international relations got the better of the Khrushchev period. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Hungarian crisis, et cetera, that really bogged down the effort for economic reform. So by the time Brezhnev replaces him as general secretary, there's a cooling of relations in the Cold War that will then allow for the state, again with the economic minister Alexei Kosygin, to pivot itself really towards consumer products. So you get the more widespread distribution of personal automobiles, which comes with building the infrastructure for automobiles, roads, gas stations, stops, et cetera. As I said, home appliances is a big deal, and other smaller consumer goods, clothing, jewelry, wine, etc., all this stuff. And with a new emphasis on consumer goods, there is an anxiety amongst party conservatives, particularly those people who assume their positions during the Stalin period. There's an anxiety among them that focusing on consumerism can have corruptive effects on the Soviet people, right? It'll get them too used to luxury. It'll make the differences between the Soviet person and the capitalist person very different, or virtually the same. And so there's an anxiety over overconsumption, right? They don't want the Soviet people to become gluttonous, essentially. And I use the film V to demonstrate how the film is depicting just that, the effects of vanity, of overconsumption, of gluttony, of disregard for decor, et cetera. So the main character, for example, he's a seminarian, so he's young, he's naive. He sniffs snuff, he does tobacco, and all these things that he's not supposed to do in a church, but he can't help himself from doing them in the church, which is part of the root of his torment. He steals, is one of the first scenes in the film, is he steals a food from the old woman, et cetera. So the dangers of this sort of ignorance that consumption can create in people, that I use the film to show that there is a real anxiety that's emerging in this period over how to satisfy the demand for improved living standards among the Soviet people with keeping that proclivity for consumption at bay.
So then going from a movie like V to these other Soviet films, it seems like there's a few that come out in the 70s that you cover, but it seems like uh, there's much more Soviet horror that comes out in the 80s and also, into the early 90s before the fall. Well, why is that? And I mean, there's even a few that I know you don't cover in the book. There's one, I think it's from 86 or so, called Psy, that's like an animal attack movie. I guess you could say it's a thriller, but there's all these sort of horror or thriller movies that come out in the 80s into the 90s to the fall of the Soviet Union. Why do you think that is? Is there a reason that there's that sort of gap between the 60s and that period?
I think that part of it is that the anxieties among the Soviet nomenclatura, the Soviet regime and the Soviet people intensified, particularly beginning in the late 70s and then through the 80s. And that's why you get a rapid succession of reforms in the 80s, for example. But beginning in the 70s in particular, the film from the 70s that I analyze is
King Stock's Wild Hunt, right?
King Stock's Wild Hunt, which is a Belarusian film and based on a story by a Belarusian national author. The book itself is a sort of commentary on Belarusian nationalism. So it's not that popular in the Soviet Union, but it's remade into a book and into a film. And as a requirement for turning it into a film, they have to kind of dial back the Belarusian national aspect of it officially. But as I point out in the book, there are subtle ways in which it's still making the particularly Belarusian national argument that come out in the story. So there's tensions that are emerging in the 70s, in the late 70s.
It's also a movie that's like trying to reckon with the legacy of Stalin, right?
It's yes, from the Belarusian perspective, because Belarus, as Timothy Snyder, for whatever it's worth, called it, bloodland, right? It's one of the areas of Europe that historically has suffered the most catastrophic results of warfare throughout Europe, and including during the Soviet period. Belarusian intelligentsia, for example, who are nationalistic, are kind of purged from their role. And so again, the story itself is about precisely that. It's about a Belarusian intellectual who goes out into the countryside and interacts with an aristocratic family. The aristocratic family is being tormented by a ghost horde, I guess, if you can call it that. But really what it is class warfare that's happening on the countryside. But it again is framed in sort of this national lens. But for our purposes, what it indicates, at least for me, is that there are real national tensions that are emerging in the late 70s that you can start to see in the films that are being produced.
That, in a way, you're giving a history of the Soviet Union through the lens of these horror movies.
Exactly. And part of that is a recognition that national particularism and a demand on the part of, for example, people in Belarus to be recognized for the suffering that they underwent as their own particular group is a demand that really starts to come out by the late 70s and then carries into the 80s as many of the emerging nationalist and even pro-independence groups are kind of empowered in the second part of the 1980s, right? So I think most of your listeners will probably know that one of the major explanations for why the Soviet Union collapsed is this national particularism, right? The the Baltic states, Uzbekistan, and even Russia are advocating for independence by 1989. And that the cause of that is, they're all blaming each other for having suffered the most. Russia is saying we're developing our oil and gas and exporting it to other Soviet republics who don't give us enough in return for it. And, the Baltic states are saying our resources are being extracted by the Russian chauvinist power, ostensibly for the Soviet project, but it's just going to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So all these national tensions are emerging and becoming a problem. And I consider King Stock's Wild Hunt, and just the fact itself that it is even produced into a film, as like indicative of this emerging anxiety of national particularism. But then, it does jump from that film comes out in 1979, and then it jumps to the 80s, particularly Perestroika, and that's for two reasons. The first reason is Perestroika and Glasnost really opened the floodgate for horror. They make horror permissible as a genre, and so you get films that are explicitly branding themselves as horror films. And so Mr. Designer, Господин Alfamito is 1987. Veld is 1987 as well. And then, the 90s is sort of the early 90s, 90 and 91 are the real moment of Russian directors experimenting with what for them is a completely new genre.
So basically, you have sort of a whole new breed of filmmakers coming up during essentially a period of really, strong reforms.
Yes. So I use those films to point out how the themes of them are reflecting anxieties in Soviet society and Soviet politics. So, with Mr. Designer, Господин Alfamito, there's a whole lot of religious themes because the Orthodox Church at the time is sort of reemerging under Perestroika and Glasnost and trying to reclaim its place as integral to Russian nationalism. And so I analyze the religious themes that are in this story about a person that recreates that creates, I guess, a human out of a dummy, and that dummy goes on to torment him. The next chapter on the Veld is very explicitly a story about it comes out in 1987. Chernobyl.
It's interesting too because it's based off of Ray Bradbury's story.
Based off of Ray Bradbury's story, it comes out the year after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and it's very much a cautionary tale about technology, the over-reliance on technology, and essentially what are toxic communities. So there's even scenes from the film where people are in hazmat suits going through the city, moving through the city, suggesting, literally pulling from the images of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Anxieties over environmental destruction and technological disaster, caprice, over-reliance on disaster. The next chapter, Semya Vodolakov, is or Fear of the Vampire Family, which we talked about a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting because, by the time you get to those vampire movies like Bloodsuckers, right, it does seem like we're getting into territory that is, as you put it in the book, more familiar to like Western audiences.
In the 90s, not just because of Perestroika and Glasnost and the reforms, but also because now Russian directors, actors, producers have more access to Western films for the first time. And so they are seeing the tropes of horror films. By the 90s, horror films in the West are very developed, right? We've gone past the John Carpenter era. We've gone past the trauma era, all this stuff, right? Like Halloween is done. Friday the 13th has been made. Texas Chainsaw, The Exorcist, right? All of these classic horror films that came out for us early in the 80s or 70s are finally Russians and people in the Soviet Union finally have access to them for the first time. And you can imagine what it's like to be an aspiring director and get access to all these films. You have to analyze, like, how do they produce the effect of fear, of fright? What are the frights that they're engaging with? What kind of music do they use to set the scene, right? What are the literal effects that they use? Blood, how do you depict murder, guts, and stuff like that? And so these films that come out in the 90s are not like particularly that great. In fact, some of them I would not recommend listeners to watch, just because it's a very amateurish attempt to replicate the tropes of Western horror films from novice directors. But some of them are pretty decent, and I think that the Fear of the Vampire Family is one of them. That although the technology used to record it, the cameras literally are not that good, the sound quality on any version that you'll find is not that great. I do think that it's a worthy film, especially for the director. It was his first film, and again, it uses an old Russian story, and I use it as to make a commentary on the changing relationship between the generations that are happening as the Soviet Union is disintegrating. You have, very common in Russia at the time for nuclear families to live together, right? You have the child, the parents, and then the grandparents all living in one house or one apartment. And as the Soviet Union is collapsing, as things are changing, industry is being privatized, the economy is tanking, conditions seem to be getting worse. You can imagine that there are a lot of generational tensions that get talked about within those apartments.
I was going to say, it's very interesting to me that you have this maybe mini horror boom at the end of the Soviet Union, because it reminds me of, I think for a lot of people, the golden age of horror in, American cinema, or maybe the Silver Age, depending on whether you're a fan of like the Universal monster movies, is that sort of period from like Night of the Living Dead into the 70s. And really, like a lot of those American movies, you mentioned Texas Chainsaw, even a movie like The Exorcist, I think they very much reflect the tensions of the time in America, because you had Watergate, you had the Vietnam War, and I think directors like Romero, Tobe Hooper, John Carpenter were all very influenced by that. And I think there's a connection between tense periods in a country's history and the rise of horror. And it seems like that's also true in the case of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's one of the theoretical frameworks that I set up in the introduction, is that there's no coincidence that horror as a genre really emerges and gains strength in times of social upheaval and social anxiety.
This is a way for people to sort of explore their anxieties. Yeah.
Right. The best example is, as you said, kind of the golden or silver era of Western horror being like the Reagan years, intense Cold War competition, fear of nuclear confrontation, I guess. So it kind of explains films like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, right? Where you have like this, I don't know, toxic, weird kind of aliens that are clowns at the same time. All these different creatures that are explored in this period, or serial killers that come in moments of social upheaval. It's also, I think, with the fear of social upheaval, there's also just the relative fear of the unknown, and the possibility of of nuclear disaster, of confrontation with the Soviet Union, of climate change, which after 1979, the Club of Rome publishes the limits to growth is getting more and more talked about. All of these things are become social anxieties that are then reflected in the genre that is meant to exploit those social anxieties, those fears, which is horror. One author calls it a resonance violation, right? That's what horror is supposed to do. It's supposed to cross the boundaries of what is permissible, what is acceptable. We live in a time where I think that the boundary probably can't be crossed really much more than it has been. So now it's like, how creative can you get by linking 12 people by the butt and mouth, to
right. It's almost like we've passed the point of anything being transgressive.
Right. And so now it's more like, how much blood can you fit into this film? How gory can you make it? It doesn't really violate if you're a big horror fan, it doesn't really violate what you would come to expect with horror anymore. But at that time, it was all new, and that's why Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I feel like in the West, is still considered to be one of the greatest of all time, just because so much of the imagery of that had violated what was expected, I guess, in horror films. And the Soviet Union in the 90s can't really replicate that, right? Because it's been done by the West. What it can do is render these old Russian stories into films in some way. And of course, in trying to maintain some semblance of artistic decorum, I guess. So you get a movie like Bloodsuckers, for example, which is about an aristocratic society that are vampires, essentially. It's not particularly scary. It doesn't really, for a Western audience, it doesn't violate anything that we hadn't seen already. But for Soviet audiences, it was a little, uncomfortable.
In some ways, it was something they'd never really seen before. Yeah,
exactly. And again, as the chapter in my book is about, again, reflecting on a social anxiety that was very present, which is there are conservatives in Russian society and in the party who are quick to blame women for what they consider to be the denigration of Soviet morals and of socialist morals. Women become kind of scapegoats. Prostitution. There are articles published in the party theoretical journal about the social risks of prostitution and how transformations that are happening, perestroika, glasnost, are all engendering loose morals among women, which are having an effect on men and their ability to maintain socialist determination. And that that film, which is again about a society of aristocratic women that are literally leeching off of men.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting that you bring that up because, I forget the essay he brings it up in, but I remember reading a Stephen King essay where King argued that in a way you could argue that horror is often, if not always, a very conservative at best or a very reactionary genre. I'm wondering what you think of that in terms of Soviet horror, that idea that horror feeds into like conservative tropes, maybe.
I don't think that it's purposefully conservative. I think that conservatives tend to scapegoat a lot, in looking objectively at social and economic conditions. conservative politics tends to scapegoat simple solutions, right? We're seeing that in our own time. We have been, I mean, in American politics is just that. And so in that sense, you could have the most socialist film director direct a movie, a horror film, but it has to engage with those conservative conspiracies, those conservative scapegoats. It's the only way that it can kind of demonstrate to people the absurdity of the idea itself. You know, that there's a whole lot of films that come out in the West. What is that vampire film with David Bowie?
The Hunger.
The Hunger. There's Vamp, right? There's all these movies that come out in the West that.
That's a deep cut, by the way, that you just mentioned Vamp. Thank you.
Yeah, there all these films that come out that are in the West that are, you know, there's no coincidence that they come out first around the AIDS epidemic, and B, that there's so many sexual themes in there. And
right. Well, The Hunger is like basically a lesbian vampire movie. Yeah.
And yes, I was going to say homosexual themes in there that again, it's not that the director is a homophobe or anything like that. It's that they're pointing out to people the absurdity of scapegoating homosexuals or scapegoating, you know, I don't know, I guess the cultural intelligentsia of people like David Bowie and who he represents in The Hunger, for example. So again, it's not that, like, I don't think that horror is a conservative genre, but it is almost always responding to conservative conspiracies. And I'll call
it's always responding to the fear of the other, right? You know?
And that happens to be, you know, conservatives fear the other, I think, more than anyone else. So it tends to be that.
So then you also deal with lycanthropy at the end of the book. Why did you feel it was important to deal with that topic, and how do you sort of fit it into the bigger picture?
That's a good question. So after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, there's a noticeable production of werewolf-themed stories and movies. So the last chapter I called the lycanthropy of Russia because you know, in following the theme of my book, which is tracing these social, political, and economic transformations through the lens of horror films, there could be no coincidence that vampires, right, which symbolize transition itself, come as Russia is transitioning from being a Soviet Socialist Republic to being now the Russian Federation, and privatizing industry, of creating a new constitution, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the confusions and absurdities that come with that. You know, so, you know, one of the earliest experiences that I ever had in Russia when I lived there in 2012 was talking to an older gentleman, a friend of mine's father, who, you know, all he said was, I woke up one morning and my country was gone and my passport was irrelevant. You know, and thinking about that, and thinking about the reality of your country disappearing, right? And you sort of being stateless for a moment until a new state can constitute itself and establish itself, really made me think about this transitionary period. And again, it can be no coincidence that werewolves are a common theme in short stories of people like Victor Pelevin, and then also in films, right? If we're talking about fear of the unknown and anxieties, then werewolves are the theme that come out in this point of transition.
So in terms of understanding Soviet horror more broadly, what do you really hope listeners get out of this conversation? Also, what do you hope they get out of the book? Like, what are you hoping to convey to them?
Well, the main purpose of my book was to try to present late Soviet history in an entertaining way, in a way that, you know, people who are interested in horror can read. I mean, because I don't know about you, but I don't know how it is in Florida, but up here where I am on the upper East Coast, a lot of the same people who are into leftist politics or socialist politics are also into horror films, right? And there's a lot of misconceptions about the Soviet Union that I wanted to clarify, elucidate through the use of horror films, so that somebody who's into horror and only loosely has a very loose understanding of Soviet history could read, right? And you can get a description of this film with an analysis of its context, right? And then you can go watch the film, and maybe you disagree with me, maybe you don't. It all doesn't matter. So that's sort of one takeaway. The other one is just simply that there are fun ways to learn and to teach history. It doesn't all have to be dates and names, and that I think it goes a long way towards kind of dispelling American or Western exceptionalism, especially when writing about, punk rock in the Soviet Union or horror. I think there's a lot of misconceptions that Americans have about the Soviet Union or Russians in particular, in what, we understand from Cold War propaganda what Russians and Soviet people didn't have, but we don't really have that much of an understanding of what they actually did have. And what they did have is not too dissimilar to, what we have. And so I wanted to explore that too. I mean, for me, growing up in punk, when I lived in Russia again in 2012, I met somebody who invited me to a punk show, and my first response was, I had no idea that punk even existed in this country. So yes, hell yeah, I'll go to a show. And the same applies to horror. So I think that if we can draw the parallels between American culture and Russian/Soviet culture, then we can start to see people as human beings, kind of separate from the political narrative, I guess, that makes us think of, Russia and Russians as the evil empire. You have the image
or just totally alien, right? Like,
right. It's like the image of what's his name, Ivan. The from Rocky, was it Rocky 4?
Ivan Drago.
Yeah, Ivan Drago. You have this kind of machine, like, he's supposed to be a Soviet. He's supposed to be Russian, but I don't think that the actor is actually Russian.
No, it's Dolph Lundgren. Yeah.
Yeah, you have like the depiction of this Russian as this kind of machine automaton that I think a lot of Americans kind of adapted as their image of Russians, right? And so if you can show that no, Russians, average Russian people are just like us. They have horror, they have punk rock, they have all these things that we love. Then you're kind of doing a little bit more to bridge the gap, the identity gap.
What do you think the biggest illustration of that is from your book? That there is sort of despite cultural differences that are obvious, there is some shared elements when it comes to looking at Soviet culture or Western culture. Like we sort of have the same fears in a lot of ways.
I think that's it. I think that's just precisely it. We as Americans know and learn so much about the nuclear anxieties during the Cold War. Like, our parents had to hide under their desk and stuff like that. But we know very little bit about the fact that, the Soviet people felt the exact same way, that they were also scared of nuclear confrontation or AIDS when it was a problem, when it was a major problem, an epidemic, etc. So I think that each chapter kind of reflects that bridge in itself. So yeah, that's another thing that I hope people get out of it.
Yeah, and of course too, I mean, I think it's an interesting book because, I think when people hear Soviet, they just think Russia, but the Soviet Union is much bigger than Russia, and you deal with movies that aren't necessarily Russian. So I do think it's it sort of illuminates, the more complex picture.
That was another factor that went into deciding which films I would write about, right? I didn't want them all to be from Mosfilm or Landfilm or one of the Russian film studios. I wanted to have kind of a more panoramic. So there's a film from Uzbekistan, there's one from Belarus, and then of course Russia. There's also a film that is produced in conjunction with an American film studio. That's one of the werewolf films that I talk about at the end in the 90s. So yeah, I tried to be geographically encompassing.
So one thing I wanted to get into was, I think there has in recent years been more attention on some of these Soviet films, V in particular, right? Um, why do you think in the past we sort of haven't gotten these films? We didn't really have access to them the way we've gotten access. Like Americans have had access to, say, the Italian Yallos, or the films of Argento, Jean Rollin from France. But really, it seems like we didn't have that much great access to these Soviet films. What's the reason for that?
It's two that I can think of right now off the top of my head. One of them is just obviously Cold War, cultural wars, the lack of accessibility on the part of the West, and then also the dominance of Hollywood. Why would you import foreign films when Hollywood is already so dominant in American culture? You don't want to add another competitor to that. B, I think that the introduction, the emergence of the internet has facilitated the spreading of these cultural relics, despite, they can't really be stopped anymore. If with enough willpower, anyone could find a torrent of any film that they want to at this point from anywhere. The other part of it, I hope, is a re-examination on the part of our generation, millennials, but then also Zoomers, a re-examination of the Soviet past, of the Soviet legacy, a kind of recognition that the way that Soviet history was written and told during the Cold War was very, not just biased, but propagandistic, right? And so we're kind of in me, especially as an academic, as a scholar of the Soviet Union, are kind of going back to the archives to re-examine the way that we understood certain aspects of Soviet history, right? And that's not necessarily excusing, it's not saying that the Soviet Union was this like glorious utopia that needs to be found again, but recognizing that there were aspects of the Soviet Union, particularly in social welfare and in culture, that are worthy of celebrating and not suppressing. And I think that that's another reason why, some of these films are coming back. Another explanation that I'll give related to the internet one is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, Mosfilm, Lenfilm, all of the national film studios, the copyrights for a lot of their films were kind of up in the air and in question, which is why you can go on YouTube now and pretty much all of the major Mosfilm movies are for free on there, because the copyright on them is tenuous after collapse.
That leads me into another question. What is the difference maybe between how Mosfilms produced a movie compared to Hollywood? Is there a difference? Are there similarities? Can you delve into that?
The difference was in funding primarily. Mosfilm, in order to create a film in a national film studio, you had to get state sanctioning of the Cinematographers Guild or Union, because that's where the funding came from. Whereas in Hollywood, you have private investors that sink their money into movies, private film studios, etc. So Marvel, which is a part of Disney, is not owned by the American government in the same way that Mosfilm was run by the Soviet government. And so funding is a major part of it. And so again, going back to this theme of reanalyzing the Soviet past, it's not necessarily that there's always censorship in the Soviet Union as much as the state decided what films were worthy of being produced because it ultimately held the purse. So censorship is kind of a simplistic way to think of it. And yes, by all means, the state could not fund a movie because it was censoring it. There are films that are produced in the Soviet Union that are never released, right, for various censoring purposes, or that aren't released until the 80s that were filmed, way before. But it's more so the state determines what is worthy of investment in production, whereas in Hollywood,
It sounds like there's a big concern when it comes to Soviet film production with, is this work culturally relevant, or is it, I mean, for lack of a better term, is it like Philistine,
yeah, is it relevant, is it productive, does it contribute to the betterment of society and Soviet man in scare quotes, or again, if it's in horror in the pre-80s period, is it decadent, right? Does it not contribute anything? And again, the social value of horror that we have talked about here wasn't something that was really developed in the Soviet period.
But you were going to say, whereas with Hollywood.
Right. Whereas with Hollywood, you have private investors, private film producers who, as much as they say with the right investment, you can produce whatever you want, we both know that that's not true, right? That Hollywood has its own censorship, and certain people won't fund certain films about certain themes, right? So censorship is everywhere.
I'm curious, you've mentioned a lot of the American sort of milestones in horror, like Texas Chainsaw and The Exorcist. I'm wondering, I don't know if you know much about like French or like Italian horror, but how would you compare maybe the horror of, like an Argento or Roland's movie to like Soviet horror? You've talked a lot about the sort of compare and contrast with American Hollywood horror, but do you have any thoughts on, I guess, European horror versus Soviet horror?
Depends on, I mean, if you're talking about the 80s, I think that Soviet horror always is perpetually behind Western horror. Again, in terms of acting, production, storyline, everything. It's always behind because it got such a late start.
Right, whether we're talking about Western European horror or Hollywood horror, the sort of Soviet horror lags behind both of those. Yeah.
Yeah. So European horror, particularly the Italian stuff, always had an ability to compete with Hollywood in pushing that line, whereas the Soviet Union entered that competition way too late, that it didn't even really have a competition. It was kind of just borrowing from what worked in the United States, what worked from Europe, and what didn't. Although sometimes I think there's some misunderstanding regarding what worked. So, like music, for example, you watch some of these horror films from the 80s and 90s, and there's very questionable music choices that just don't really fit what we consider horror music to be, but again, it's a mix of not understanding the genre and then also being novice directors in totally new to the genre.
The reason I asked this, by the way, is because when you talk about like the movie Bloodsuckers, I'm reminded of certain European horror movies like Jean Rollins' Fascination, which also dealt with aristocratic vampires. So I think in some ways, some of that European horror and its sort of anti-aristocratic themes may have been mirrored in some Soviet horror in ways that you don't see in Hollywood sort of horror movies.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, by the late 80s and the 90s, all of the films, not just from the United States, but from Western Europe, are finally coming to parts of the Soviet Union, and having a major influence on the stories and how they're written, and the themes. So yeah, it's definitely true.
Okay, the last thing I was going to ask you, what was your experience like living in Russia And maybe you could talk a little bit about your experiences with punk rock in Russia.
So I've lived in Russia a total of 5 times. Beginning in 2012, I was in Nizhny Novgorod. That's where I was introduced to punk rock in Russia, and that kind of tipped the domino to the rest of my first book, which was on punk in Russia. And then the last time I lived in Russia was 2019. I was there as the war with Ukraine started. I was living in St. Petersburg. And I've always had a blast. I mean, I think that the Russian people are very welcoming, very hospitable, very fascinated by American culture in a way that most Americans wouldn't fathom, wouldn't understand, because again, politics and propaganda. So, I've always seen it as a task of mine to, again, go back to what we were talking about earlier, to bridge that gap, that misunderstanding between the two peoples, regardless of politics. I don't really care what Putin is doing or saying to Joe Biden. Yes, I understand that it has geopolitical ramifications and consequences, but what I care more about is how are my friends in Russia who, for example, are very anti-war, how are they doing? How are they understanding this crisis? How is their familial relations being impacted by the Z campaign, for example? These things interest me more than what Putin is saying. But I mean, of course, it's all related. So my time there was a lot of fun. I was sort of forced to leave as the war started because my funding got restricted. I wasn't going to leave. I felt perfectly safe in St. Petersburg as the war started, but I was sort of forced out. So I hope to get back someday.
What's your observations about Russian punk? I don't know much about Russian punk. I'm more familiar with so I like a lot of electronic music. And one of the things that I thought was interesting the past few years was we had this sort of micro genre arise of what's been called witch house music, right? Which is sort of like rap and electronica sort of put together with this sort of slow gazing vibe. And it's odd because there's actually a whole micro genre within that micro genre of like Russian witch house music, which adds like a Russian folk music element. So I'm interested to hear more about, the elements of Russian punk and just sort of what that scene was like, because it seems like there's a lot of genres that get their own sort of Russian spin when they are embraced by Russian culture.
Yeah, I mean that's the case with punk. It's probably enough worthy of another podcast episode, but again, its genesis is through Western examples, particularly the Sex Pistols and intercepted BBC radio transmissions from Leningrad, which is the closest point in Russia to Western Europe. It develops that way, always kind of parroting Western punk until you get to the 90s, where there's some nationalism that is kind of inflicted into the punk scene and sound. There are bands that try to sing in English, and then there are bands that are structuring their songs around the Russian language, which is a very particularly sounding language, and poetically different than English. So the scene itself, I would say today is very much like any other American city scene. Moscow is giant, of course. And there's like the commercial punk bands, and then there's sort of the underground punk bands. And you'll be happy to know that in the past, last time I was in Moscow was 2018, I think. Techno music and just electronic music itself was like really booming. There were punk musicians that I knew who had quit their bands and became DJs. And Tbilisi, Georgia, for example, I was just there a week ago. It is known for its electronic scene. There are just clubs everywhere, and the clubs are kind of strict to get in. Some of them are, but you'll be happy to know that the electronic stuff is very popular in Georgia as in Russia. I'm not sure Russia anymore. A lot of the people that I knew in the punk scene have fled Russia since the beginning of the Ukraine war and then mobilization that happened about a year ago.
Do people have misconceptions about the punk scene? Because I feel like in America, if you were to say Russian punk, the only thing people are going to say back is like, yeah, that's like that like Pussy Riot band, right? But there's actually a whole scene. It's not, you know.
Yeah, I started the research for my punk book before Pussy Riot did their like now famous action in the cathedral in Moscow. And so while I was researching that book, people would always bring up Pussy Riot. And the interesting thing is that Pussy Riot is not of the punk scene in any way. Like none of the people that are involved in Moscow's underground scene have ever seen the girls from Pussy Riot before, never heard of them before their action, and consider Pussy Riot to be a politically avant-garde protest group rather than an actual punk band.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when I've seen some of their stuff, just online, it doesn't feel like it has some of the aesthetics of punk, but I never really considered it like a punk band.
They use the label as punk as a political statement, which is fine. As I say in my book, I have a whole chapter about Pussy Riot in that book. And as I say in that book, the definition of punk is fluid, right? And it's not my job to define for anybody what punk is, but to provide some possible definitions of what it is. And does Pussy Riot check some of the boxes? Sure, absolutely. Do they belong in the scene that I was analyzing? Not according to the people that are in it, right? The people that are in it, never heard of them, had no idea who they were, never saw them at a show before, and so they would exclude them from it. But yeah, I got a lot of that when I was researching for that book, a lot of questions about Pussy Riot and stuff, which was expected. But as I said, when I started researching for it, I knew Pussy Riot as a protest group, but they didn't have nearly the international recognition that they got after their protests in, I think, 2014.
What's the like defining elements of the Russian punk scene and like its influences? I know you mentioned like bands like the Sex Pistols. Is there any like bands that take from like, the sort of hardcore punk scene, stuff like Black Flag and whatnot?
I mean, they all of that stuff has been imported into Russia and hugely influential for the formation of Russia's punk scene itself, whether hardcore or punk or whatever subgenre you want. And there are bands throughout its history that kind of signpost the evolution of that sound. So, the early period in the late 70s and 80s, the first punk band is the Automatic Satisfiers, which is a play on words from the Sex Pistols, right? Автоматически удовлетворительный. There's in the 90s in St. Petersburg, there's Korol Shoot, which is I have a very unique sound. Most of their songs are about folklore and like strange paranormal things. There's Naive in Moscow, who kind of sounds like Green Day. Distemper is like a ska band that emerges in the 90s, right? So you start to see the development of the subgenres as well in the punk scene, so that by the time you get to the 2000s, hardcore is firmly there. There's a hardcore scene that's separate from this more commercialized punk scene, with all the imported sounds from the West. But then it becomes a question of how do we have a band that sounds like Minor Threat, for example, but singing in Russian and using Russian rhyme patterns and schemes? And so that, for me, was always more interesting. There's no shortage of Russian bands that sang in English because it's easier to write lyrics in English. So it's always more interesting to me, the bands that ventured to write lyrics in Russian and perform in Russian, because it changed the sort of sound of the music a little bit, in my opinion.
There's some cross-pollination too between certain Russian punk bands and even American bands, in the sense of I know Nick Oliveira from Queens of the Stone Age has worked with, I think that it's a Russian band called the Svetlanas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it sounds like, there's a lot of cultural cross-pollination that happens through punk. It's like one big community.
It did. It was a little bit more possible and permissible before the Ukraine war, but as I said, most people that I know that were really influential people in Russian punk have fled. A lot of them are in the Caucasus now, or Kazakhstan, or somewhere else. Still doing punk things, but just not in Russia. It's a tragedy, really, because it'd be a dream if they all came back if the war ended, but we'll see what happens.
Anything else you want to say in closing, just to wrap this up on the whole subject of Russian punk? We could probably do a whole episode on it at some point.
Yeah,
but
I'm happy to. Happy to do another episode on that. As far as closing, people can follow me on social media. On Instagram, it's at @punksaround. On Twitter, I think it's Herbert. I'm not sure. You'll find me somehow. My DMs are always open if you have questions. I respond to everyone as long as it's not polemic, trying to argue with me for some stupid reason. But I'm always open to talking. So yeah, check out the book if you want. You can find it.
And are there any Russian punk bands you would recommend to people?
I really like the band Mraz, Mraz, I think is the Latinized form of it. Mraz is really good. Fake Fun is another one. They are based in Tbilisi now, but originally St. Petersburg. Cobra with a K, Kobra, is some more friends of mine. So there's some bands worth listening to. Relevant bands today, bands that are still around.
So I'll let you get going, but I hope listeners will check out Fair Before the Fall. It's a really interesting book that I think you'll get a lot out of it if you're into Soviet history, but also if you're just into horror movies. So it kind of can tick both boxes for people.
Thank you.
So thank you again, Alexander Herbert.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.